Alexander Hamilton is the unlikely founding father who wrote his way into the pages of early American history. Theodore Roosevelt called him the most brilliant American statesman who ever lived. He is the subject of the musical Hamilton at the Public Theater in New York. Writer and composer Lin-Manuel Miranda takes Hamilton's legacy to new heights using hip-hop, R&B, and music. Here is a look.
And I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry. And I'm not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. And yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry. And I'm not throwing away my shot. We gonna rise up. Ain't time to take a shot. We gonna rise up. Ain't time to take a shot. We gonna rise up, rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up, rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up. Take a shot, shot, shot. Hey, yo, it's time to take a shot. Time to take a shot. And I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. I am Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, just you wait. I am not throwing away my shot.
Joining him now is the writer, composer, and star Lin-Manuel Miranda and the director Thomas Kail. Hamilton is scheduled to move to Broadway this summer. I am pleased to have both of them at this table. Welcome.
Thank you.
It could not be better, could it? Not being here, but the response to this. It is really remarkable. Who's coming? Everybody wants the hot ticket in town. Everybody wants to come. The critics are crazed by it. Two guests on my show, Peggy Noonan over the weekend, David Brooks today, wrote wonderful columns about it. I mean, what more do you need?
There's nothing more I need. You sit in a room for 6 years making something, and you have the wildest dreams version of how you think a show will be received, and we're experiencing that. So we're just trying to hang on while we can. I started writing this in 2008 while I was still in my show in the Heights. Right. I was on my vacation, my first vacation from the show, and I picked up Ron Chernow's book at random at Borders, just knowing that he died.
Saw it there and said, "I'll take this one."
Just said it had great reviews on the back, and I knew he died in a duel, so I knew it was going to have a banging ending, and fell in love with the story. Really, the Dickensian nature of Hamilton's life, almost from the first and second chapter.
Explain that, because there's a point in which you say Dickens, Dickens, and Dickens. Yeah. What was the Dickensian aspect of his life?
Alexander Hamilton was born in Nevis, possibly out of wedlock. He was his father split by the time he was 10 years old. His mother died in bed with him a few short years later. His brother was apprenticed, so he was by himself to a blacksmith, so he was by himself. He got sent to live with a cousin after his mother's death. The cousin killed himself. And then he got put in charge of a trading charter. He was a clerk for a trading company that traded sugarcane and rum and slaves. They're at the key point of the triangle trade down there in St. Croix. And he rode his way off the island. There was a hurricane that had ravaged St. Croix, and he wrote a poem about it, describing the carnage, saying that he saw sights that would strike astonishment into angels. This poem was used for relief efforts for the island, and people took up a fund to get him an education in New York.
Okay, so here we have a character who, a great American. We know there's drama that he dies at the end of a duel, of which he may not have, in fact, fired his gun.
Yeah, there's lots of different
speculation about that.
Yeah.
All right. So here we have that story, but you have translated into so much more. I mean, tell me about the ideas that you want to pour into this to make it a new look at the Founding Fathers, the American experience, and a different way of presenting it that would appeal to young people because you're peopled by young actors. Well, diversity.
You speak to what we were really conscious of, which is how do we eliminate any distance between our story and now? Yeah. We know that the story was going to be set then, but we knew it was going to sound like now. And we knew that fundamentally this is a country that was founded and created by immigrants. Somebody in all of our lines stepped off a boat or some form of transportation, put their foot down on this soil, and went to work. And so as we started thinking about taking the inspiration from Ron's book, we thought, okay, here are a lot of events, but we have to tell a story. So we had all of the events laid out. We sort of both read the book and made our own timelines. And then we would compare. hey, this really spoke to me. Hey, this moment feels like it's essential. And so then you have those things to build around. But it just became so apparent early on as we were really designing how the show could function, that this idea of doubling characters, for instance, felt really right on. That the character who played Lafayette, one of his great friends,
also plays Jefferson.
Yeah. Of course, they both have this connection to France. They both have this relationship, one antagonistic, one supportive. And so how can we make the audience feel like who they are and what they understand is actually not so different from what these people were struggling with?
Hip-hop seems like a genius stroke now, but that's what you knew.
That's the first thing I checked, by the way. So I read 2 chapters of this book and I go, someone's already done a hip-hop version of this, because it felt to me the quintessential hip-hop narrative. This is someone who grew up in hard times and wrote his way out of his circumstances, wrote his way towards a better life. And that is the hip-hop narrative from the South Bronx in the 70s to today. And so I Googled Hamilton hip-hop musical.
And
now if you Google
it was not there.
And it was not there. And so thank God, now you Google it, you'll see my show. But I really, that was the first thing that jumped out at me was this is a fundamental hip-hop story.
Just for a moment, the relationship between the two of you were
Lin was a real hotshot freshman when I was a senior.
And he was creating things way back then?
What I mean was he was stealing lights from my productions, even though I didn't even know it was him.
Yeah, it's true. We found out we shared a light plot for a production, even though we had never met. Yeah. We didn't meet until after I graduated college.
So I had heard about In the Heights. A couple of my buddies, John Mailer and Neil Stewart, saw this early proto version of In the Heights in the year 2000. Yeah. I had graduated. They said, you got to meet this guy. And they were right.
And did you hit it off right away?
Yeah. What we like to say it is, I met Lin in May of 2002.
I graduated the week before.
And we basically never stopped talking. So it's just been a 13-year conversation that has led us to this table, which is slightly mind-blowing.
How do you compliment each other?
Well, I say, Tommy, your hair looks great.
And I say, Lin,
no. You know what I mean. How do your skills mesh with his skills?
Well, one of the things that I credit Tommy enormously with all the time is, both in the creation of Heights and in the creation of Hamilton, Tommy is someone who likes to come in and work, no matter what the outside world wants of us. So when In the Heights happened and we were both broke and had day jobs, he would say, well, bring in a song on Friday. Bring in a song on Friday and we'll talk about it. And he kind of created deadlines for me even when we had no apparatus or way of knowing whether the show was going to be anything. And it created somewhere for me to go and something for me to do and something for me to work towards. We've kind of continued that with every project we've worked on.
Yeah, and Hamilton was a continuation of that because Lin read that book and wrote one song. He didn't write 50 songs. He wrote a single song thinking maybe I'll make this into an album. And that was in 2009. He happened to do it at this little place on Pennsylvania Avenue. And he did this, the only song that existed from whatever this potential Hamilton thing could be. And what I realized in that is that it was no different from the relationship we'd forged on Heights, which is what Lin is able to do is take very complex ideas and not show you how smart he is, but make them accessible to all of us. One of the things I think, one of the great gifts that he's given us with this show is he doesn't stand up there and say, look where I am, you're down there. He builds a ladder, and he says, come up here and be up here with me. And so my job was to help try to architect that ladder and get every single person who walks into the Public Theater and the Richard Rodgers on Broadway to participate and feel like it's also for them. And I think that's one of the things I've been riding shotgun on for over a decade now and really admired. The lyrics go, I'm just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot.
Charlie Rose is rapping.
I hope we're rolling on this.
We're rolling on everything. But you performed that at the White House, right?
Yeah. I performed the opening number at the White House, actually, the Alexander Hamilton, the opening number of the show. Yeah.
Before we see that,
yes,
is that what the president responded to when he said Geithner should see this?
Yeah. Yeah, I told them, I told the assembled audience, this was my first time performing the song in public. Yeah. They had asked me to perform something from In the Heights, and I said, I have 16 bars about the first Treasury Secretary, and they allowed me to close out the show with that. And his response was, somebody got to get Geithner in here, because he
thought of Geithner as a Hamilton, or what?
Yeah, well, I think he had a quote at that time, because the economic crisis everything had just blown up, and he said Geithner's got the hardest job as Treasury Secretary since Alexander Hamilton. I think that was his quote on the record about what Geithner had ahead of him. And this was very early in Obama's administration. We performed in May of 2009. So, they were just figuring out how to do this thing, how to get us out of the hole we were in. So I think he was tickled by the fact that I'd made a Treasury Secretary sing, and I think he wanted to show his Treasury Secretary.
And that song was from Burr's perspective at that point. So he also performed it from Burr's point of view. So it got a laugh about halfway through.
Now, where did that idea come? Aaron Burr's perspective.
Well, honestly, I look to musical theater history. We have a great tradition, thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber, of the antagonist narrating the story. Judas narrates Jesus Christ Superstar. Right. Che narrates Evita. Yes. And so that was immediately where I went. That set up the very difficult task for me of figuring out who Aaron Burr is, who is, as we say in the show, a villain in our history. He is known as the guy who shot Hamilton. More of him. I do, after learning a lot about his life, and I had to find my way in because there are a lot of biographies of Burr. Well, there are several biographies of Burr.
One as novel.
Gore wrote a historical fiction novel. His Burr is a lot craftier than mine, but one of the things I learned about Burr was he's an early feminist. I mean, his daughter received an education greater than any man of that era. He was very close with his wife and with his daughter. He was on the Manumission Society with Alexander Hamilton for the abolition of slaves in New York City, in New York State, and so there are redeeming characteristics to this guy. I had to find my way into that because every biography either is insanely defensive of him or vilifies him.
But they were different in the following way, which you know better than anybody. Explain to me, because on the one hand, Aaron Burr was amazingly cautious, careful, laid back. Alexander Hamilton wanted to charge forward at every moment.
Yes. Hamilton left behind 27 volumes of written work. Burr left behind less than 2. And I think that sort of tells you everything you need to know about how much Burr reserved the right to change his mind about any position he had at any particular point. And the tragedy of the show is, at the moment when Burr is finally reckless and lets go, and Hamilton is cautious and throws away his shot, one kills the other. And that's how they're remembered forever.
And, one of the things that we were talking
together forever.
And I think Hamilton knew they would be bound forever, and whether that would ensure his legacy as someone who then had to be spoken about. He'd become slightly obsolete at that point in his life. This is someone who had thought about death so often in his life, and here he was towards the end, not empowered, not able to affect change in that way. And we talked very early on, and I think, again, it's to the credit of the writing and to Leslie Odom, who plays Burr. We said, we've seen a lot of stories about two enemies who shoot at each other. Let's make a story about two people who were very dear and complex friends, and one of them kills his friend.
Who were soldiers, lawyers, statesmen together. They
admiring of each
students.
Other.
Yes.
Yeah. You thought about playing Burr?
Yeah, every time I wrote a Burr song, I said, man, I should play this guy. I mean,
Because he was the narrator, or because?
Because he gets all the best songs in the show. And as you'll see, Leslie is, now you watch the show, you can't imagine me playing the role because it really fits Leslie like a glove. Yeah. But he gets these wonderful moments. One of my favorites being The Room Where It Happens, where he is talking about not being in power and seeing Hamilton trade away the Capitol in exchange for his financial plan and being like, how am I not in this room? How am I not in the room where it happens?
Take a look at this. This is you at the White House in 2009 performing the first rap song you wrote for Hamilton. Here it is.
How does a bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by providence, impoverished in squalor, grow up to be a hero and a scholar? The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of the trade and charter, and every day while slaves were being slaughtered, a carted away across the waves. Our Hamilton kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, or barter. Then a hurricane came and devastation reigned, and our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Well, the word got around, they said this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. And there's a million things he hasn't done, but just you wait, just you wait. When he was 10, his father split, full of it, debt-ridden. 2 years later, see Alex and his mother bedridden, half dead, sitting in their own sick, the scent thick, and Alex got better, but his mother went quick. Moved in with a cousin, the cousin committed suicide, left him with nothing but ruined pride, something new inside, a voice saying, Alex, you gotta fend for yourself. He started retreating and reading every treatise on the shelf. There would have been nothing left to do for someone less astute. He would have been dead and destitute without a cent of restitution. Started working, clerking for his late mother's landlord, trading sugar cane and rum and other things he can't afford, scamming for every book he can get his hands on, planning for the future. See him now as he stands on the bow of a ship headed for a new land. In New York, you can be a new man. The ship is in the harbor now, see if you can spot him. Another immigrant coming up from the bottom. His enemies destroyed his rep. America forgot him, and me, I'm the damn fool that shot him.
There you go. It's unbelievable.
Thanks.
Yeah. Could this ever have been done? I mean, it's almost like if they didn't have hip-hop, it had to be invented and created for this.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Thank you. That means a lot. You know, there's a lot of, I think the score is both a love letter to both hip-hop and musical theater. There's a lot of references to both embedded throughout. But you're right, it is this heightened language, and we learned really early on in the process of making it that anytime we dipped into ordinary speech, into prose, the energy just kind of went out. Like, we kind of had this ball that we throw in the air so high at the top with this opening number that we kind of have to keep it at that level a lot of the show. And there's a lot of times when we take musical breaks and slow it down and speed it back up again, but this heightened language seemed to be the only way to sort of convey Hamilton's worldview.
Did you once say that Hamilton reminds you of Tupac?
Yeah. Yeah, I think he... in that he embodies so many contradictions. He is both thoughtful and boisterous. He is both brilliant and self-destructive in certain ways. You know, he'd get into fights that, in retrospect, why are you fighting with that guy? And that's what I think when I think about Tupac's life, who was so brilliant and embodied so many different things to so many different people. I think Hamilton carries that many contradictions with him.
Your family somehow involved in politics in New York?
Yeah, my dad's been a political consultant for years. He was Koch's advisor for Hispanic affairs.
So there was this sense of the intrigue of politics within you as another...
More of an allergy, actually. You know, I grew up around politicians my whole life.
Yeah.
New York politicians, local politicians. I know what it is to fight for turf. I know what it is to fight for, you know, these amount of blocks for a council member, and I sort of grew up inoculated by it.
You weren't surprised, though, that in the end he played Hamilton?
No. And another wise casting decision by me. You know, when Lynn and I were working on Heights all those years ago, one of the early conversations we had was, well, you should play the main character just until we find somebody else, you know, just because it's too hard to teach them. And then we did the show. Lynn ended up playing the lead character of that show. And we said, all right, for the next show, sit next to me. We can be out there in the audience watching it together. And then he wrote that first song and did it at the White House. And I said, okay, so for the next show. And I knew where it was headed.
Now, was there a residual sadness about Hamilton?
That's something that I think we deal with both implicitly and explicitly in the show. He was someone who suffered so much loss at such a young age, profound sense of loss and lack of belonging. And so he's someone who came here so unmoored and looking for something to hold on to. And then all along his path, he endeared himself to these often older men who said, let me take you in, one of them being George Washington, who he refused to see as a father figure, but from the outside.
Why did he refuse to see him as a father figure?
I think
because he was the chief of staff to General Washington during the
war.
war.
Yeah, at like 22.
Nothing brings you
And
closer.
by the way, quit because he wanted a command, and he saw battle as the only way for social mobility, and he knew he had no family connections and no family past.
So he was thinking of social mobility.
So he was thinking, one of the first letters we have of Hamilton, he writes to a friend and he says, "I shall conclude by saying I wish there was a war." Even at 14, he was thinking, that's the only way I'm going to rise in my social station.
At that point.
Which is interesting because the American history is about the president we most admire. We're commander-in-chiefs of war, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Washington.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, basically 15 minutes from Mount Vernon. And one of the things we've been talking about a lot recently with George Washington, in light of your question about Hamilton, is what Washington did by stepping down, by not running for a third term. Of course, he would have been elected. Is he said, I need to teach this country how to move beyond me. I need to, as Lynn says in the lyric, teach them how to say goodbye. And there's something incredibly poignant watching this moment where Hamilton, who looked up to so few, is literally in that moment looking up to Washington, who has this idea of something so much grander and greater. We often talked about, what does it mean to build a cathedral? What does it mean to build something that won't be completed for generations?
Yes.
And so for someone who came from so little and just wanted to have life around him, he tried to create life for the generations well beyond when he was going to be gone.
Rebecca Mead of The New Yorker said, Miranda portrays the Founding Fathers not as exalted statesmen, but as orphan sons, reckless revolutionaries, and sometimes petty rivals living at a moment of extreme volatility, opportunity, and risk. And what's interesting about American history, and this musical shows it, is that for all these geniuses coming together, it all fell apart in feuds and accusations and colliding ambitions.
Yeah. A war really holds people together. And once that war is over, it's tough to figure out, all right, so what's the country we all agreed on? And, I think people think of the Founding Fathers, they think of those portraits of John Trumbull, and they think, oh, well, those were the days when everyone agreed and talked, but that was maybe 6 months that existed. You have Hamilton and Jefferson with fundamentally different versions of what this country can be, and those are the fights we're still having.
And what Oscar, I think, and the public theater believe in so deeply is finding these kinds of voices,
yes,
introducing them to audiences, and celebrating these moments. The idea of us doing something, when we were even talking about the costume design, for instance, we knew this was not a show with wigs and powder. This was about anything that was nothing dusty. This had to feel and move like now, even though the costumes and clothing is very much then. This idea of introducing these stories, that mess, that blood, to an audience today, again, still grappling with things that feel in their history book dead. But now, for those 2.5 hours, in the theater, alive and vital, and watching the show with high school kids, as we've had, a couple matinees, who are seeing some of their first shows ever, or hearing that refrain in the lobby, both from them and from people older, why wasn't I taught like this?
Ken Burns, the filmmaker who did the film about Lincoln, among many, many others, said to me that he could never watch the scene of Lincoln being assassinated without crying. It was so hard for him to come to grips with that scene. Was it hard for you to come to grips with Hamilton and death?
Yeah. Well, yes and no.
You knew it was your moment in...
It was the last moment I wrote for the show. Hamilton's side of the duel before he gets shot. And, well, frankly, historians for 250 years have been wondering why that guy shot his gun in the air instead of at his opponent.
No doubt he did that.
In my version, he absolutely does that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's historically what happened, but that's the one I chose to run with.
Okay, but there are people who argue that point.
Yeah, there are people who will argue
any
point in American history, anything, especially that significant.
Okay. But that appealed to you because it said something about the Hamilton you imagined?
I think Hamilton, yeah, absolutely. The part where I cried the most, the part that was very difficult for me to write, was Eliza's life after Hamilton.
Yeah.
I cried. I burst into sobs with every couplet that I wrote for that. Yeah, my poor dog was whimpering. My wife was in the other room like, can I get you some water? You know, I always remember that.
Why?
Because she made her life so significant, and she went on to have she went on to live another 50 years.
Yeah, and she
went
was
on to meet Lincoln when he was a senator. She lived into the 1850s, and
she charged herself with his reputation.
yes. Well, he was succeeded. The next 4 presidents all hated her husband.
Yeah.
You know, you've got Presidents Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, who almost got into a duel with Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, son of the guy who hated her husband, and so she was. She made it her mission to make sure he was remembered.
Was it his ideas or his persona that those who hated him hated him?
I think it was a little of both. I think this is a guy who was used to being the smartest guy in the room. In any room he went into, he just happened to be in a room with Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, a bunch of other geniuses. So there was certainly arrogance. He was younger than all those guys. So there's the arrogance that comes with being the young guy who thinks he knows everything. And, you know, John Adams was obsessed with his perceived sexual licentiousness. I mean, I've never insulted an enemy the way John Adams talks about Hamilton. Exactly. We used to have it was cut in previews, but we had a whole thing, a list of just mean things Adams said about Hamilton.
What was that line he had about son of a whore and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. His ambition, I'm sure, stems from an abundance of secretions that he cannot find enough whores to draw off. So, you know, this is not a well-loved guy.
We think we talk bad of each other now.
And we think it's bad on Crossfire. It's way worse. It's way worse when John's writing to Abigail.
Yeah. A love letter to Abigail.
A love letter to Abigail, right.
But you're moving it to Broadway.
The official opening is August 6th, but starting July 13th, that's the show.
You go to Broadway and see Hamilton.
That's right. And you know, we're going back to the Richard Rodgers, which is where we had the good fortune of doing our last show. Right. One of the things that is so remarkable about this story and something that really resonated, I think, with the two of us is this idea that New York City, that off-Broadway, that Broadway has streets wide enough for all of us. That this show can exist across the street from, you know, Phantom of the Opera and all of these things that were the you know, so much of the, you know, the foreground that we stood upon to try to gaze a little bit in the future. And, you know, in the parentage of our show, the grandparentage of our show, you know, Lynn talked about Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar and Sweeney Todd and Gypsy as well, and Les Mis, and all of these shows that influenced us and that we absorbed. You know, those were the things we were carrying around, just like, you know, Hamilton was carrying around, you know, the battles from, you know, 1066 and, you know, William the Conqueror, and that's what informed all of his decisions. And I think that we're just in our own very, very small way trying to you know, both this production, the public, and everything going forward to honor that legacy of a group of people who learned from what came before and tried to, you know, in some way evolve an idea.
Is this celebratory?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, it's the story of our country's founding is an extraordinary one, and to tell it from the perspective of the guy who wasn't born here, I think is an interest. Was my way in. You know, my parents were both born in the Caribbean. They were both born in Puerto Rico and came here. My dad came at the same age at Hamilton, speaking not a word of English. And you experience a country differently when you come here at a certain age, and that's our way into the story.
Thank you for coming. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
I should say this, the Public Theater, Hamilton is at the Public Theater through May 4th. Starts Broadway previews in July, the opening in August. It is a remarkable experience, as so many of my colleagues who write have written. Back in a moment. Stay with us.